Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So this is our 416 Development and Growth 2. This is a must class for you, and this is the last year class. Most of the stuff will be posted online to Huzem platform. And our classes will be on Wednesday afternoons at 1 p.m. So today we're going to start with the facts of economic growth. So let me share my screen. Let's minimize this. Okay, where's my pen? Okay, so all right, this is our first lecture, facts of economic growth. Okay, now when we talk about facts of economic growth, the earliest set of stylized facts are due to Nicholas Kaldor. Okay, Kaldor studied some of the 20th century economies, okay, and described the growth patterns of these economies by these facts. One is this: there is secular growth in labor productivity. Okay, now of course it is not very easy to define and measure labor productivity, but in the simplest possible case you may imagine this, right? Total GDP in the country, or total output, divided by total employment. Okay, and Kaldor observes that many developed economies in the first half of the 20th century, of course there's a crisis there and the world wars, but in the long run we see this growth path for labor productivity. Okay, so that's one of the stylized facts due to Kaldor. The second stylized fact is also about growth, but it is about the secular growth in capital per worker. Okay, and you may imagine this variable in this form. So suppose that we can aggregate and measure the entire set of capital stock in a particular economy, okay, and denote it by K. If you divide this number by total employment again, you find capital per worker. And in these developed economies in the first half of the 20th century, we observe some secular growth in the long run. Okay, so if you imagine drawing some figures, suppose that this is natural logarithm of y over L, you observe something like this. Okay, of course there is some fluctuation, right? Because of, for instance, this is, let's say, the crisis, right? The Great Depression. But in the long run, if you forget about these short-run fluctuations, then in the long run there is this secular growth, and the same is true for this variable. Okay. Now the third fact is this: real return on capital is largely stable. Okay. Now, when I say real return on capital, I basically, of course, mean that, so if you save in an economy, then that saving will realize a return, of course, some capital income, right? And firms will make investment spending by applying for loans from the banking system, and they will pay a particular rate for this loan. So if you take all these into account, if you imagine that there is only one financial asset in the economy, that real return associated with that asset is also largely stable. And by stability, what we mean is something like this, right? So if you draw a figure, then what you observe is something like this, right? So there's no growth. It is largely stable. Okay. Now another stability result is concerned with capital output per worker. Sorry, capital to output ratio. Capital output ratio is also largely stable. Okay. Now, why is that important? Well, in the Harrod-Domar model, remember, capital output ratio is a fixed number, right? In the later models, you're going to see, for instance, the Solov growth model in a couple of weeks. It doesn't have to be stable. It can actually change in time, but in the very long run, that particular variable in the neoclassical model, for instance, in the Solov model, does not have, does not converge to positive infinity, does not converge to zero. Okay, it always remains within a particular range. Okay, sometimes it is 4, sometimes 5, sometimes 7. So usually it is greater than 1, obviously, because the stock of capital is larger than. So in one way we have to measure capital, of course, in these models. But according to Kaldor, the evolution of this variable capital output ratio is also largely stable. Now, there are other facts. One is the income shares. Okay. So this is the income share of capital, right? Capital owners. And this is the income share of workers, right? Because this is the total number of employment, total flow of employment, L. If you multiply it with wage, you have the total wage income divided by total income, you have the wage share in income. And this is the capital income share, right? Because for each unit of capital, you earn a return of R. So RK is some real measure of capital income, and the capital income share in GDP or GNI, however you measure it. So Kaldor observes that these ratios are also stable. Okay. And finally, we have large growth rate differences. Growth rate differences across economies. Okay, so there are many economies. We index these economies by letter I, for instance, right? And I calculate long-run growth rates of these economies. For instance, for the next 50 years, for the past 50 years, I calculate the long-run growth rate of GDP per capita, for instance, or capital per worker or labor productivity. In these economies, I compute these growth rates, these long-run growth rates, and I compare and contrast different countries, and I observe sometimes large growth rate differences. Okay, so let me elaborate on this a little bit more. So if you actually do this for many different economies, okay, and if you put, let's say, GDP per worker on the horizontal axis, okay, GDP per worker in, let's say, 1960. Okay, and here you put average growth rate of GDP per worker in, from 1960 to 2000, let's say. Okay. Now each dot will be a different economy. Okay. Each dot will be a different economy. And what we do have something like this. What we see will be something like this. There will be some growth miracles here. Okay. So these are growth miracles, such as Japan, Singapore, Korea, Taiwan. Okay. Then you will have some high-income economies that have this type of growth rates. So some rich economies grow at slower rates. Some poorer economies grow at relatively higher rates. Okay, so these economies would be, let's say, OECD and EU economies. Okay, and some Latin America, some Asian economies, etc. And the rest is located here. And some countries actually record negative long-run rates. Okay. Now these ones with very low growth rates are growth disasters. Okay. So we observe in the very long run, we observe a huge variation in growth rates. Okay, look at this range. Oh, by the way, this is around, let's say, 7% per annum. Okay, so annually, this is around 7%, and this is 0, obviously, right? So we observe such differences. So there's this huge range, as you see. Okay. So that's one of the Kaldor facts, and even Kaldor observed that for the first half of the 20th century, but we also observe it today. So if you redraw this type of graph, for instance, for 1960 to 2020, and so this is G for that period, and this is Y at 1960, you also observe something similar. Okay. So yes, there are some countries that suggest that, okay, initially poorer economies grow fast, but some initially poorer economies do not grow faster. Okay. So we will see how we can understand such dynamics using different types of models as well. All right. Okay, so that's for the Kaldor facts. And by the way, let me also emphasize one thing. This one, especially the fifth one, the stable income shares, this was not really so stable after 1980s. Okay, because after 1980s, after 1980s, this slightly increased and this slightly decreased. Okay, so since 1980 in developed economies, in US, in UK, Western Europe, Northern Western Europe, etc., the general tendency is that the capital income share is slightly getting larger and labor income share is slightly getting smaller. Okay, so if you imagine, you can actually observe something like this. So this is between 0 and 1. So this is, let's say, 1980, right? This is the time. So you observe, for instance, initially capital income share is like 1/3, but it is now slightly larger. The labor income, so this is capital income share, if you like, and the labor income share is something like this. Okay, of course these fluctuate, but I am showing you the trend basically. Okay, so this part, of course, I mean this portion of history is of course associated with market fundamentalism, neoliberal policies, after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, etc., etc. So actually, if you measure the difference between marginal productivity of labor and the real wage, okay? So real wage, so marginal productivity is like going like this, let's say, okay? Marginal productivity of labor, but real wage is not going at the same rate, okay? So this particular relationship is so this relationship, this difference is particularly larger after 1980, okay? Or 1980s. All right. Now, of course, 1961 Kaldor is pretty old, right? So we want to understand new stylized facts. New stylized facts of economic growth. Now here I'm basically using a paper by Jones and Romer. It's 2010. I think it is American Economic Journal, macro. I'm not sure about that, but I'm going to post this paper online so you can read the paper. So these guys identify some new stylized facts. Okay, and one of them is this: increasing the extent of the market. Or increases in the extent of increases in the extent of the market. So when I say market, I basically mean a couple of markets. One is the markets for goods. The other is the markets for ideas. The other is the markets for financial funds, let's say. And the other is the market for people, okay? Now, because of two things, one is globalization, and the other is urbanization. Now we observe larger markets all across the world, okay? Within a country, we see urbanization processes going on, markets getting larger in that sense, and markets are getting much more connected compared to half a century ago. Okay, and because of globalization, international markets are much more connected as well, and international markets are much more larger as well. Of course, there's also population growth, uh, right? So population growth is also part of this process. Okay. Now the second thing is the very long run acceleration in growth. Very long run acceleration in growth rates. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is this. You actually know this story because we discussed that in the beginning of the previous semester. Suppose that this is time, and suppose that this is present. Okay. Now, if I look at England, and if I look at the evolution of British economy in the very long run, okay, the growth rate of GDP is, the evolution of GDP is something like that, right? So it fluctuates, and at some point, this growth becomes secular. Okay, so there are fluctuations. There's actually a bigger shift here for Black Death, right? And somewhere here we have the Industrial Revolution. But the idea is that, historically speaking, modern growth is a very new phenomenon. Okay, because if you extend this path to the earliest episodes of human history, you observe something very similar. All right, so there's a set of anthropological evidence and archaeological evidence that suggests earlier human societies were all alike in terms of the level of GDP. So long-run growth rate was nearly zero. Only with the modernity, only with the Industrial Revolution, only with the expansion of markets all across the world, and that's typically after the Industrial Revolution or the industrialization of a country, then we observe growth rate differences across time, right? So if you draw the growth rate itself, okay, for a particular economy, that growth rate was like nearly zero, right? And then it accelerated and converged, and in some economies it actually slowed down. Okay. For instance, in UK, in US, in Japan, in these high-income economies, there is this growth slowdown as well. Okay. So that's the second fact that Jones and Romer actually emphasize. Now there's this third one. The third one was the variation in modern growth rates. We already discussed that. Variation in modern growth rates. Okay, so if I observe long-run growth rates for many countries, right? There are many countries in my sample. Now, for these countries, there is a variance, okay? And that variance is large. The fourth one is, so we have large income and productivity differences. So that's also very important, okay? So income and productivity, large income product differences across countries. So this is also observed by the Kaldor as well. So if you draw some inequality, so let's say this is income levels and this is the density, okay? So you observe typically a poor club, many countries are poor, then you observe a rich cloth. Okay, and the similar figure applies to productivity as well. The fifth one is increases in human capital. Again, when I say human capital, what I basically mean is education plus health. Okay, so we observe, we look at the long run, and we observe in many countries, educational spending is getting larger, health spending is getting larger, so people accumulate what we call human capital. They become physically and mentally, I mean, maybe not mentally, but in some economies at least, they become physically and mentally better. But most importantly, they learn new skills. New skills. Why is that important? Because new technologies require new skills. Okay, so people are not just doing this for fun. People are doing this because there is a demand for their skills. You're entering university exams, university entrance exams. You are getting a college degree because you anticipate that, you expect that in the market, after you take your after you graduate, in the market, in the job market, there will be some firms, there will be some production plantations that will demand, that will have some demand, some sort of demand for your skills, for your knowledge, right? So there is a return for that, and given that there is a return, you keep investing in education and health. All right. And the final one, again, they also have 6 of them, right? Yes. So the final one is this. This is again Jones and Romer, 2010. So the final one is the relative stability of wages. Okay, so what do I mean by this is this. So suppose that there are 2 types of workers. One is low skilled, let's say with high school education. Okay, the other is high skilled, let's say with college education. Okay, now let's denote these by L, these low skilled guys, and denote these by H. Okay, now we observe that wage ratio. Okay, it is sometimes called skill premium. Okay, so this is something you can measure by looking at people's average wages, right? We also have this ratio, right? The number of high-skilled people divided by the number of low-skilled people, right? The number of high-skilled workers divided by the number of low-skilled workers. Now, what we observe here is that this is increasing. Okay, so this variable is increasing. I mean, let's say for the US, I mean, it is increasing for many countries, but let's look at the US. In the US, this variable is getting increasing. What does this mean? People, I mean, more people are getting college education, right, in time. However, this is largely stable, this variable. Okay, so even if the relative supply is getting larger and larger, the relative supply is getting larger and larger, the relative wage is not getting smaller, right? So how does this be possible, even in the simple labor market? Well, obviously, there is a larger demand. I mean, the supply is getting larger, but there is, of course, a larger demand for these high-skilled guys, okay, relatively speaking. And that is related with two things. One is called, of course, globalization. So there's this trade channel. I can explain this later on. And the other is called skill-biased technological change. So those factors explain demand for H, or the relative demand for H is getting larger. Okay? So my friends, these are the growth facts. Old facts due to Kaldor, new facts due to Jones and Romer, and our theories will be focusing on such growth facts. Okay? Now I can stop and let you ask questions or comment on the material. We have 2 minutes. If you want to reconnect again, I have time. We can reconnect again. But that's all for today's lecture from me. Any questions? So, all right then. Okay, I will post 2 readings. One is very long, but it is very good read. The other is short, I mean, relatively shorter. Those papers are really interesting, and it's about the facts of economic growth. So just check on them and read them. So you learn a great deal of the material that we will be dealing with in this semester, okay? And next week, we're gonna continue with some analytical mathematical issues. Okay, some methods I want to give you to refresh your minds. Maybe I can post some guidance for the next week as well. Okay. All right. Then I am ending this session and see you next week on Wednesday afternoon.
Teşekkür ederiz hocam.
All right. Bye bye.